Last year I made the Scorpion axe and a few people watched the video and seemed to like it. This year I'm making a new version using some different techniques that I think is even better. Starting with the handle, I'm using this offcut of a pecan slab that I picked up from vintage reclaimed lumber here in Oklahoma City. After removing the bark, I cut it to size lengthwise before milling it down on my joiner and table saw to a 2-inch square block. Here I'm laying out where I'll cut in some angled notches on the bandsaw, and this is where the epoxy will get poured and gives the finished piece a unique look after turning on the lathe. And here I'm charring the interior of those cutouts to give the final piece contrast against the light wood of the pecan handle, and I just think it looks sort of cool. Moving on to the epoxy form, I'm cutting up some 1/2-inch plywood I had laying around the shop. I'll add some sheathing tape to the form before assembling with pocket screws, and this is going to allow the epoxy to release easily from the form. For the epoxy pour, I'm using Total Boat's thick set epoxy, and I'll do the pour in 2 segments, 1 inch deep at a time. I had soaked the Scorpion in water to soften the joints, and after that first pour, I posed the Scorpion with some pins and then let that dry. Once the epoxy is tacky, I can add the Scorpion and then press it down gently into that first layer to keep it from floating up as I add the epoxy for that second pour. I jumped on eBay and found an inexpensive vintage axe head with an interesting shape, and mine actually came all the way from India and it's hand forged. I cleaned up the back end of the axe head on my belt grinder so I can add a secondary bit which I'll forge out of this old hammer. Now I'm new to blacksmithing, so this was a good little project to practice my technique. I can already tell after seeing the footage that I definitely need to make a better anvil stand, as this one was jumping all over the place as I worked. That said, this was tons of fun and I'm excited to dive into blacksmithing further. Back over to the McBride, I cleaned up and further shaped the axe bit I just forged. I cut it off on the bandsaw and then used a small wheel attachment to grind in a small radius to match the radius that's on the back of the axe head. I'm attaching this with a MIG welder, making sure to get some good penetrating welds, or so I hope. I don't know, we'll see if it breaks off later. After some initial shaping on the belt grinder, I sketched out the final shape of the axe head, which I'm going for a bearded axe tomahawk hybrid thing. Maybe there's an actual name for an axe like this, I'm not sure, but if you know, make sure you leave a comment down below. After all that grinding, I just need a bit of firework to clean everything up before moving on to the heat treat and the oil quench. Turning my attention back to the handle, it's had 3 days to fully cure, and it's looking pretty good so far. I need to cut the handle down on my table saw in order to fit the handle into the chuck on my lathe. And speaking of that, I picked up this Excelsior mini lathe and the extension bed from Rockler. Now this is my first turning project ever. And after getting this lathe, I was pleasantly surprised with how easy it was to set up and use for a complete newbie like myself. And if you're looking to get started turning, I cannot recommend this lathe enough. I've got a link for this awesome yet inexpensive lathe down below, along with all the other tools and materials I use in this project. I started by taking light passes as I began to get a feel for using the lathe and this carbide turning tool. I ended up chipping out some of the epoxy at first, but once I turned up the speed and adjusted how I was holding the tool, I started to get those smooth ribbons of epoxy coming off. And after that, I settled into a rhythm and I felt much more natural as I went along. Here I made some pencil marks where I wanted the axe head to sit, and then set my calibers for the width of the bottom of the axe head where it's at its narrowest. Now I can use this measurement to turn the handle to fit the axe head with a friction fit. Last, I cleaned up the handle with some sandpaper, working my way through finer and finer grits before using some micromesh sanding pads and wet sanding the epoxy until it was glass clear. Like I mentioned, this axe head is held on with a friction fit and a couple taps of a mallet to seat it. Once I had the axe head locked in, I could cut off the excess handle material and then soften those edges with a file. Last, I added some boiled linseed oil and I was all done with this axe. Or so I thought. It broke. It broke. It broke. So I was playing around with the axe head off camera and decided to throw it like a throwing axe, and one throw and it snapped. When I make projects like this, it's more about having fun and making something unique versus making an axe I can fell a tree with. Now I thought it would be strong enough to throw, but it clearly wasn't. I think I can fix it with epoxy, and I want to chop some things with it at the end of the video to see what it can really handle. First, I sanded at the break to give the epoxy a place to adhere to. Then I brushed on some more thickset epoxy and put it in a clamp to cure. I still had a little divot after putting it back together, so this time I used some silicone to create a little dam and then poured some more epoxy. Now the moment of truth and putting it back on the lathe. I was very nervous this wouldn't work or I would break it, and it was hard to find center again. I took extremely light passes to remove the rest of the silicone and then used sandpaper to remove as much of that excess epoxy as possible. A few more light passes with the carbide tool and I was able to sand it the rest of the way. Last, I polished the epoxy with those micromesh sanding pads and made sure not to throw it at anything this time. And of course, it wouldn't be a proper axe if you can't shave your legs with it, or so I'm told. I love the way the Scorpion Axe version 2 came out. I think it's much cooler than the first version, and it was fun to learn all the new techniques required to make this year's version. Thanks for watching this video, and let me know down in the comments below what sort of crazy weapon you'd like to see me build next. Also, make sure to get subscribed and follow me over on Instagram. And a big shout out to Rockler for supporting this channel, and seriously, if you're looking to get a lathe, the Excelsior Mini Lathe is perfect for getting started. A big thank you to all my Patreon supporters, especially my top patrons, Matt Varughese, David Britton, DFM Toolworks, Maker's Best Friend, and Lex the Historian. Okay, thanks for checking this one out, and I'll see you back here next time.